In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland with nearly 500,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, and over 2,000 aircraft. Finland had a population of 3.7 million people, virtually no tanks, and almost no air force. Stalin expected the war to be over in 2 weeks. It was not. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary military upsets of the 20th century, and one of the most morally complicated wars in modern history. After Finland survived the Soviet invasion, it made a decision that would haunt it for decades. It sided with Nazi Germany. This is the war nobody talks about. Stalin's gaze fell on the map of Finland in the autumn of 1939, his generals pointing out the border that ran just 32 kilometers from the heart of Leningrad. The Soviet leadership saw danger in every kilometer of exposed frontier. On October 5th, the Kremlin sent Helsinki a formal demand. Finland was to cede the Karelian Isthmus, hand over the Hanko Peninsula for a 30-year Soviet naval lease, and surrender the islands of Suursaari, Taidorsaari, and Monasaaren in the Gulf of Finland. The Soviets insisted these terms were about security, not conquest, offering in exchange a slice of Soviet Karelia and promises of grain shipments. But the real trade was clear: sovereignty for survival. The Finnish cabinet met in tense sessions, weighing each demand. Foreign Minister Eljas Urho responded on October 7th, accepting only the Hanko lease and minor border clarifications. The isthmus and the islands, he argued, were the backbone of Finnish defense. To give them up would be to open the country to whatever fate Moscow decided. The answer was firm. Finland would not trade away its independence for the illusion of safety. In the Baltic states, the same demands had already been made and accepted. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania allowed Soviet bases on their soil, only to lose their independence entirely within months. The Finnish government read these events as a warning, not a model. Within Helsinki, there was no appetite for capitulation, but also no hope of foreign rescue. Britain and France watched, but offered little more than diplomatic protest. The population, 3.7 million, faced the prospect of standing alone against a neighbor with more tanks than Finland had rifles. The deadlock was total. Soviet negotiators broke off talks, and the machinery of invasion moved into place. The border would not move by diplomacy. The fate of Finland would be decided by force, not by signatures on a treaty. At dawn on November 30th, 1939, the silence along the Finnish border shattered. Soviet artillery thundered across the Karelian Isthmus, and Red Army columns pushed forward in dense formations, expecting a brief campaign. Stalin's generals had promised a 2-week victory, and Finland would fall with barely a struggle. But the first act was not just military. Soviet bombers roared over Helsinki, dropping their payloads into city streets. Dozens of civilians died in the opening hours. The world watched, stunned, as the Kremlin insisted these were not bombs, but food baskets for the hungry. Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, faced foreign correspondents with a straight face. In his Vestia, he claimed, "Our aircraft are not dropping bombs of terror, they are delivering the food that the Finnish people have been denied." The Finns replied with a kind of gallows humor that would echo through history. As Soviet planes continued their deliveries, Finnish defenders began hurling glass bottles filled with gasoline and a rag fuse at Soviet tanks and infantry. They called them Molotov cocktails, a drink to go with the food. The term appeared in Finnish newspapers within days, and by December, the world's press had picked it up. The bottle became a symbol of resistance, improvised by civilians and soldiers alike, a simple weapon against steel and numbers. Yet Stalin's plan ran deeper than bombs and tanks. On December 1st, Soviet authorities announced the formation of a Finnish People's Government in the border town of Terijoki, led by Otto Wille Kusinen, a Finnish communist long exiled in Moscow. The so-called Finnish Democratic Republic promised land reform and Soviet friendship, but it was a government with no country. Few in Finland or anywhere else recognized it. The real government remained in Helsinki, battered but unbroken. International reaction was swift and damning. On December 14th, the League of Nations voted to expel the Soviet Union for its unprovoked attack, the first time a major power had been cast out. The resolution passed overwhelmingly, with the USSR standing alone. But moral outrage brought no armies to Finland's aid. Britain and France condemned, but sent no troops. The United States issued statements, not weapons. The Finns faced the world's largest army alone, under the shadow of Soviet propaganda and the threat of total occupation. In the snow and smoke, the psychological battle was just beginning. Snow fell in thick silence across the forest of Karelia, muffling the sound of war. On paper, the Red Army outnumbered the Finns in every category: men, tanks, aircraft, artillery. Yet the battlefield told a different story. Finnish platoons, dressed in white camouflage from helmet to boots, vanished into the woods. They moved on skis, gliding over drifts that trapped Soviet columns. In the deep cold, temperatures often plunging to minus 40 degrees Celsius, mobility became a weapon. Soviet troops, weighed down by heavy coats and clumsy boots, struggled through waist-high snow, their dark uniforms stark against the white. Finnish soldiers, many of them hunters or lumberjacks in peacetime, covered 30 kilometers in a day, striking and disappearing before the enemy could react. The heart of the Finnish defense was the Matti tactic. Rather than confronting Soviet forces head-on, small Finnish units would slip behind advancing columns and cut the narrow forest roads. Soviet supply lines, already stretched and poorly mapped, were severed. Entire battalions became isolated Mattis, surrounded by forest and snow. The Finns would then reduce each pocket one by one, using grenades, Molotov cocktails, and close-range fire. Soviet tanks, designed for open plains, bogged down or froze in the subarctic cold. Finnish technical manuals from the 1930s had drilled these methods: move at night, attack from cover, never let the enemy rest. The cold was as much an ally as any rifle. Soviet rations froze solid, engines seized, frostbite crippled thousands. Finnish troops carried extra wool layers and heated their food over small stoves, often scavenged from village houses. Their supply trains moved at night, guided by memory and the faint glow of the northern sky. Even the smallest details mattered. Rifles and machine guns were painted white, sleds carried ammunition through the trees, and every patrol rehearsed escape routes before a single shot was fired. The Red Army, trained for set-piece battles, found itself lost in a maze of lakes and pines. Orders from Moscow demanded progress, but the columns stalled. Soviet officers, many new to command after Stalin's purges, sent men forward in rigid formations only to see them vanish into the snow. The Finns, outnumbered and outgunned, relied on speed, camouflage, and the relentless cold. In this landscape, technical edge meant knowing how to disappear and how to strike when least expected. The road to Suomussalmi cut through endless forest and bitter cold, a place where maps became useless and the sun barely rose above the horizon. In December 1939, 2 Soviet divisions, over 17,000 men, pushed west along a narrow track, expecting to reach the heart of Finland in days. Instead, they vanished into the pines. Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo, commanding fewer than 9,000 men, watched as the Red Army columns stretched for miles, bound to the road by supply trucks and heavy guns. The Finns moved on skis, white-clad and nearly invisible. Night after night, they slipped through the trees, cutting Soviet lines into isolated pockets, or mattis. Temperatures plunged to minus 40. Soviet soldiers, poorly equipped for the Arctic, froze in their trenches or died when their rations and fuel ran out. Finnish patrols struck from the darkness, using memory and instinct to navigate the woods. They carried light weapons, Molotov cocktails, and the knowledge that each Soviet Matti was a battle they could win. Over the course of 2 weeks, the 44th and 163rd Soviet Rifle Divisions ceased to exist as fighting units. More than 8,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, fewer than 200 Finns died. The rest surrendered, starved, or staggered back east through the snow. Soviet tanks, abandoned and half-buried in drifts, marked the road like tombstones. Among the Finns, one figure became a legend. Simo Hayha, a farmer from Rautjärvi, was already known for his quiet patience and uncanny aim. In the forests near Suomussalmi and later at Raate, he worked alone, wrapped in a white camouflage coat, his Mosin-Nagant rifle fitted only with iron sights. Hayha would lie motionless for hours, his breath hidden in the snow, waiting for a target. Over the course of the Winter War, he recorded 509 confirmed kills, more than any sniper in history. Soviet troops called him the White Death. His presence haunted the frozen woods, a single man turning fear into a weapon as effective as any artillery. The victory at Suomussalmi did more than destroy divisions. It electrified Finnish morale and stunned the world. Newspapers from Stockholm to New York reported the near annihilation of Soviet forces by a country a fraction the size. Yet inside the Kremlin, the disaster was blamed not only on the cold and the Finns, but on the deep wounds left by Stalin's purges. Soviet commanders, inexperienced and afraid to improvise, sent orders that made no sense in the forest. The chain of command broke down. The Red Army, for all its tanks and men, could not adapt. The lesson was clear to both sides. Numbers alone would not decide this war. But for Finland, each victory came at the cost of exhaustion and dwindling reserves. The myth of invincibility was gone, but the shadow of Soviet power still loomed beyond the trees. February brought a new calculation from Moscow. Red Army planners, stung by months of humiliation, called up reserves and shipped in more guns than the front had seen since the First World War. Orders went out for a storm of steel. More than 6,500 artillery pieces lined the Karelian Isthmus, packed so tightly that each kilometer of front bristled with 30 guns. The Soviet command committed over 400,000 fresh troops, swelling the total force to nearly 1 million. For the Finns, the numbers were staggering. Ammunition stocks ran low, and the lines grew thin. There would be no relief from abroad. Britain and France, distracted by their own looming crisis, could offer only words. The promised Expeditionary Corps never set foot on Finnish soil. On February 11th, the Red Army unleashed the largest artillery barrage Europe had heard since the trenches of 1918. For days, the air trembled with explosions. Soviet gunners fired more than 1 million shells, pounding every bunker and trench along the Mannerheim line. The ground itself seemed to dissolve under the bombardment. Finnish defenders sheltered in shattered concrete, counting each shell and each hour, knowing their supplies would not last. Soviet infantry, reinforced and now better led after the winter's disasters, surged forward behind rolling barrages. The old tactics of isolated columns were gone. Now the Red Army advanced in mass, with tanks, sappers, and flamethrowers clearing the way. The Finnish lines, battered and exhausted, began to buckle. No amount of ingenuity could withstand this scale of firepower forever. By the end of February, the defenders were forced to fall back, abandoning positions they had held for months. The Red Army's adaptation, its sheer weight of men and guns, was overwhelming. The cost was terrible, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. In the forests and trenches, the myth of Finnish invincibility gave way to the reality of overwhelming force and international isolation. The ink on the Moscow Peace Treaty had barely dried when trains began rolling west, packed with families who had just lost their homes overnight. The treaty, signed on March 13, 1940, forced Finland to surrender about 11% of its territory, land that included the Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viipuri, and the Petsamo region. For a small country, the scale was staggering. 400,000 Finns, roughly 1 in every 10, became evacuees, carrying what they could as they left behind farms, schools, and graveyards their families had tended for generations. The text of the treaty left no room for negotiation. Soviet troops would occupy the ceded areas within days. The Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Red Army for 30 years, turning a slice of southern Finland into a Soviet naval base. Entire towns emptied in a matter of weeks, their residents dispersed across the rest of the country. For many, there was no guarantee of return, no promise that what was lost could ever be regained. The cost of survival hung heavy in the air. Finnish casualty lists totaled around 26,000 dead and 43,000 wounded. Soviet losses dwarfed even these grim numbers. Official estimates put their dead at 126,000, with more than 200,000 wounded. Nikita Khrushchev, who served as a political commissar during the campaign, later admitted that all they got was enough ground to bury their dead. The numbers told a story of resistance that had stunned the world, but also of a nation forced to choose between annihilation and surrender. In the cities and the countryside, the shock of defeat was matched only by the challenge of starting over. The evacuees faced a future as strangers in their own country, while the government grappled with the reality that independence had come at a price almost too high to bear. The guns had fallen silent, but the wounds, both physical and psychological, would linger long after the last train left Karelia. On June 25, 1941, Finnish artillery opened fire on Soviet positions. The decision to re-enter the war came less than 16 months after the Moscow Peace Treaty, but this time, Finland was not alone. Behind closed doors, Finnish leaders had weighed the agony of lost Karelia and the plight of 400,000 evacuees against the cost of accepting German support. The motive was blunt: recover the ceded lands, restore a defensible border, and erase the humiliation of 1940. As German armies swept through the Soviet Union, Finnish troops advanced alongside them, not as formal allies, but as co-belligerents with their own agenda. By occupying the north shore of Lake Ladoga, Finnish forces helped cut the last overland supply route into Leningrad, tightening the siege and contributing to the famine inside the city. The moral line blurred. Finland's survival now came at the price of complicity in a far larger tragedy. Finland's war did not end with the last shots in Karelia. The 1944 armistice demanded more than land. It required Finland to pay heavy reparations to the Soviet Union and to drive out its former German allies from Lapland, igniting a brief but destructive campaign in the north. Industry shifted overnight to produce goods for Moscow, straining a battered economy. To preserve its independence, Finland accepted a new reality: strict neutrality, careful diplomacy, and self-censorship at home. This balancing act became known as Finlandization. The country remained democratic, but every foreign policy decision was measured against the risk of provoking the Soviet Union. Survival came at the cost of silence and compromise. It was a lesson that would shape Finnish society for decades. After decades of walking a diplomatic tightrope, Finnish public opinion held fast to neutrality until the shock of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. In a matter of months, support for NATO soared from just 25% to 78%, a shift with few parallels in modern Europe. On April 4, 2023, Finland joined NATO, closing the circle that began in the winter of 1939. The lesson carried across generations: survival. Beside a powerful neighbor demands hard choices, and sometimes the promise of collective defense outweighs the old faith in standing alone. Finland's survival demanded more than courage. It demanded compromise and left scars that still divide memory from myth. Today, as Russian aggression redraws borders once again, Finland's hard lessons remain urgent. Small nations can resist, but survival often comes at a moral price. The uneasy legacy of 1939 shapes every decision Finland makes now, where the line between independence and entanglement is never truly erased. What price would we pay for our own survival?